You know how to recommend right?
I'd like to call this session together. I want to welcome everybody who's come tonight, and hope that the information you received is what you've heard. So I guess Dr. Einman, are you going to present her?
Yes. Good evening. Good evening. We called this special session for a great opportunity to discuss a great opportunity we may have once the bids for the middle school project are known. Dates for your consideration include July 16th. We received our bids for the middle school project. July 22nd, the STAR committee meets to review the bids. Board representatives include Bob Boxell, Carl Hilton, and Mark Densler. And then on Tuesday, July the 23rd, the full board will meet in special session, 5:00 p.m. to award the bids. So the excitement is truly mounting as progress is notched, one notch after the other. This evening, we want you to begin to think about the choices that we will place before you during the July 23rd special session. With all construction projects, school construction projects, the total price, the cost of the project is set and determined by the 1028 hearing and our hearing before the Indiana Department of Local Government Finance. So the maximum price for the project is set and cannot be increased. But within that limit, below that limit, you will have options dependent upon the interest rate market. We are looking at a very favorable interest rate market due to the economic conditions. And when economic conditions are strained, as they are in our nation, many times the interest rates are lower to stimulate the economy and to stimulate activity, bonding, purchasing, etc. So even though we find ourselves in unfortunate times, it's probably one of the best times to commit to a building projects because the interest rates are usually at the lowest levels. And it looks like we may come in under 1 percentage point to 2 percentage points under the projected level stated at our 1028 hearing. So we may have options to include several of the alternates. Now tonight we will not be discussing which alternates you prefer. We will discuss those after we know exactly how much money we have to include the alternates. Now remind the board members that this project, titled Phase 1 Plus, is a major renovation. However, it is not a zero-age renovation, which is a complete renovation of the entire facility. We, through the deliberations with our key communicators, committed to a comprehensive renovation tackling the major life systems in the building: handicap accessibility, fire codes, safety and security, as well as some of the educational needs on the room dimensions and traffic flow, etc. But we were not able to renovate all spaces up to today's standard of a new facility. So with that, Phase 1 Plus, we were required to eliminate some of the very important items and return those alternates. Because if the bids do come in favorably, you can add back an alternate or two or three, depending upon the interest rate market. Many boards find themselves in an unfavorable situation during the economic heydays when the interest rates are higher and they are faced with reducing the project scope. Because once again, when you set your highest limit of taxpayer burden in a project, you cannot increase that level. So if the bids come in higher, you have to either throw out the bids and rebid or reduce the scope of your project. We are in the opposite situation, which is the most favorable. It looks like interest rates will be lower, total project cost coming in lower, therefore we can add back some of the alternates that we were not able to include in the project and we had to remove because it's not a zero-age renovation. So we'd like for you to begin the thought process is needed to make these decisions at our July 23rd meeting. And I'll ask Dr. Silva to review for you the process and your options.
First of all, I'm going to give you a little bit of a reminder of where we've been. It'll help you to understand. You have these slides, in fact, in front of you, in case you have a difficult time seeing the screen. Back when we, prior to the 1028 hearing, you might recall that Patrick Brunner came up with what he entitled the Phase 1 Plus. And at that time, which is the time you have to understand that Patrick has had very little opportunity to look at any details in terms of how things would be done in a renovation. So they used some very general cost guidelines for renovating spaces. And he determined at that time that he thought that the cost of the construction would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $13.1 million. And because we would be dealing with a facility that is 80 years old, we found out back in Project 98 that there are some wondrous things behind those walls, and that our blueprints weren't always accurate. That there were some things back there that didn't show on the blueprints, and in other cases, there were things that weren't there that the blueprints said were there. So we ran, these are all called hidden conditions, and the more of those hidden conditions you have, the more you need to have a contingency pot of money to deal with those things. So these are, you might say, is dealing with the unknown. We also had an estimate of just a little over $900,000 for architect fees. Other costs would include furniture, technology, a category called reimbursables, which is dealing with everything from soil testing to acoustical studies and things like that. And in addition to that, as opposed to the interest that we pay when we issue the bonds, we also have to pay interest prior to our first bond payment. They call that construction or capitalized interest. And they expected that to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $836,000 for a total of $16,375,000. You recall that $4 million of that is to be paid out of capital projects. The balance was to be paid for through a bond issue. And then we went to the Tax Control Board. Now, I'm actually combining a couple of things because we have 1028 hearing is in the middle of this. But after the 1028 hearing, that data is refined some more, and we have our financial experts and bond counsel generate all of the documentation that we need to take before the state authority that gives us permission to proceed. Dr. Iman referred that as Department of Local Government Finance. That's their new name. The old familiar name to all of us is Tax Control Board. So at the Tax Control Board hearing, several things had happened in the meantime. One of the things was that we decided to go with a construction manager as opposed to having a general contractor. Now what that will do for us is that we'll lower the construction costs because part of the construction cost was the markup for the general contractor. So what the construction manager that we hired, Berkler, said is that we can lower the construction costs, cover the hour fees, and still give you a project that's at or under what you originally thought. Notice also that by going with a construction manager, that we also increased our contingency up to $880,000. That made a whole lot of people very happy because now we knew we could deal with more situations that would pop up. and feel pretty safe. So this fee right here that you're seeing is not just the architect's fee anymore, but it also includes the construction manager. And the other costs increased a couple $100,000 because of a category called general conditions, and that is a cost that a general contractor would bear to take care of the trailers, the construction trailers, and all of the utilities going to those construction trailers, and various costs, for example, a disposal of items, so hiring a waste management firm to take away our trash. And of course, renovation will have an extraordinary level of trash to haul away. Those are all under the general conditions category that we end up having to pay for. But you can see that the total ended up, by that time, we had even noticed that the interest rates were down a little bit, so our net interest cost was a little bit lower at the Tax Control Board hearing. But nevertheless, the total, the same 16.375 million. Now all I did was just move that second column over to the first, because now what I want to show you is where we stood last month. The latest construction estimates that we got from Berkeley, and I might remind you that, remember, we've been through several phases over the last several months: schematic design, design development, and now in June we came out with construction documents, which is the final estimate prior to creating specifications and letting out bids. So the latest estimate we had for construction costs was now over 12.8 million. And we also had a substantial decrease in our interest costs. But because our construction costs went up so high, we had to cut back on contingency in order to get down to the 16.375 million. But this doesn't even tell all of the story, because there is more to it than just that 12.8 million construction costs. Because one of the things that is very typical for an architect and or construction manager to do in a project is that as they run into a situation where they see that the project is going to cost more than they originally thought, then they begin to move items, you might say, in order of priority, the least important item out of the project, and put them into a list called an alternate list. And in essence, what happens is that those things only get funded if we ended up with enough money. How do we end up with enough money? Well, one, if Berkeley's estimates of the construction costs were wrong and they actually come in lower, which is what we hope. A second one that we're going to be talking tonight is if our original interest rate projection is too high, and therefore we can afford a larger bond issue for the same cost. So let's just go through for a second and show you that we not only have an increased construction cost, but we've got a number of items that have been put on the alternate list. All of these, except for the last one, the Spartanville upgrade, were all originally at one time or another part of the original project. So you could say in essence that all of these items from here on up should be added to the construction cost if you truly want to get a picture of what today's estimate is of the project that we started with back in Phase 1 Plus last year. And it's not surprising when you're dealing with a building this old. And it's not surprising when you're dealing with something that is not a zero-age renovation. We weren't doing a complete renovation, and we're doing it in an 80-year-old building. And I can appreciate why that would be very difficult for architects and construction managers to be very precise about the cost of renovating that space. So, nevertheless, we are sitting here with a situation where they're estimating $12.8 million construction costs and alternates now totaling $1.3 million. That's including the Spartanville. Now, back when we had that Tax Control Board hearing, we mentioned that the bond issue that we were proposing was the $12.375 million, with the other $4 million coming from capital projects. At the time, UMBA's projection on the bonds that we would issue had interest rates ranging from 4.25% up to 6.4. Now, when I say a range, it's because we don't issue one bond. We actually issue a series of bonds. So we'll issue one that's 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old, on down to 25 years old. And therefore, we're able to capitalize on lower interest rates for their shorter term bonds. And so we had bonds ranging anywhere from 4.25% up to 6.4% interest. The average was 6% if you took the composite of all of it. When you added up the principal plus the interest for this bond issue, it was just a hair over $24.7 million that we would end up paying back over the course of the next 25 or so years. The average tax rate impact as calculated by UMBAL was 10 cents, and they determined that the average cost to the homeowner was $62. Now, in terms of today's, if we were to issue those bonds today, we would be getting interest rates ranging from 3.1 up to 5.45% on those same bonds. So you can see that we're looking at anywhere from 1.15% down to 0.95. The average works out for all of those bonds to 5%. Almost exactly 1% less than what we had originally planned on. You have to plan on a higher because you never know. From the time you have the 1028 hearing, you know it's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 months or so before you ever issue bonds. And so you have to allow for the fact that in those 8 months that interest rates could in fact climb. 1% would not be difficult at all. But with interest rates at 5%, we now have an opportunity to issue a bond of $13.64 million that would give us a total cost virtually the same as the one that was originally the $12.375 million bond for the same tax rate impact and the same cost to the homeowner. So instead of us issuing $12.375 million, we could issue $13.64 and have the same total cost. Now, when you compare all of the various items now from June of last month to what this does for us, if in fact we do issue additional bonds, now we won't be able to get the full benefit. I'll go back to that screen a second. You notice that difference right there between those two is just a little bit under 1.3 million. But we can't use that 1.3 million totally for alternates because other things happen. For example, our interest during the period, because we've issued more bonds, our interest costs will go up. We also have, we had some other costs that went up because of the cost of issuing bonds. Many of those costs are tied to the amount of bonds that you issue. Our architect and construction manager fees went up slightly because they charged a percentage of the construction cost. And when we add the alternates in, that increases the construction cost. And the other thing that the construction manager wanted to do was to put some of the money back into contingency. Because you can see that we had to cut that down to $327,000, which we all feared would not be enough to deal with all the situations that we would run into over the course of the next 2 years. So that's where we stand as of today, is we have an opportunity to fund almost $950,000 worth of alternates, and as you saw in the previous slide, for no additional cost to the taxpayer because of the fact that interest rates are so much lower than we had thought they would be.
Well, question is, the tax rate is $62, is that per period or is that for the total year?
That's for a $100,000 home per year.
So when taxes come in May, they're going to pay half of the 62? Or
Yes.
they're going to pay, okay.
And that's based on this year's formula, because nobody knows what next year's is yet.
The other question I have, I noticed that the it seems that the construction costs and the engineering fees accelerate based on the increased costs. Is there some reason for that? I know they get a percentage, but it seems the more we're adding, when you're showing some of those slides, you don't have to go back to any of them, but I just noticed there was quite an increase in the architect and engineering fees based on that. Now, I know you said there was a construction manager there, but the construction manager, how long is he going to be employed?
He's employed for the full term of the
Full duration,
project.
so if it's over 2 years, it doesn't matter then?
In his contract, his
80,000.
contract's fixed, so if it goes 3 months over, he still charges the same. There was 3 aspects to why that number went up. One is that we went to a construction manager,
Yeah.
so that increased that cost, but it decreased the construction cost. The second thing that happened is that both the construction manager and the architect have fees that are a percent of the construction cost. So as the construction costs increase, their fees increase. Third thing is that when you add alternates in, you might as well put the word construction cost behind that word alternate, because if the alternates are accepted, they are now part of the construction project. And so the costs we have listed there for you are reflecting if the alternates are accepted.
If all of them are?
Yes. So if less of the alternates are accepted, the construction manager and the architect fees will be less.
I would ask about the contingency. If we would choose not to do all of the alternates, could more money go into the contingency for protection?
Absolutely.
Okay. But then it could be done later. Couldn't it be done by someone else even? For instance, Spartan Bolt upgrade could be done by someone else after the project, and we know exactly how many surprises we have.
Yes.
Okay.
Recognizing we're not going to decide all of this or priority of order tonight. However, I think it would benefit to anybody that's here, and maybe some board members, that the window thing, the reason for the 400,000 is when they air condition that building with the existing windows, because it's not included, that's when we had to squeeze out to stay under the cap, would not be able to have any kind of ventilation, any vent of the air conditioning going out. So that's really, or at least in my opinion, be number one priority, but that's up to everybody to figure that out. But that's a really pretty high value. And the other thing, during the key communicator hearings, we heard a lot of emphasis on the historic value and the value of that auditorium. Now, if you've been in there lately, I think we had a chandelier that was about to peel off to hit somebody, a year ago? And that's another item that's high priority that was squeezed out in order to stay under the original cap that really cap we had. So I want to point that out for the benefit of people attending this. That's not a case of some frill we're trying to think of, because it's definitely not a frill, but it's pretty necessary, I would say, and I wouldn't feel very good about the key communicator meetings if either of those were omitted, providing we're staying in the cap.
I would ask you too, I know in the 98 project, one of the things that we toyed with and hoped to do was preserve the brick and the mortar between the brick on the exterior. I forget what that's called, that process.
Tuck pointing is the
yes.
order in between.
Okay, but it didn't happen, and it's not in the alternate list. So has it been done and I just didn't know it, or?
It's part of the project.
It is part of the project and will be done
It's
in
under
the
the
project?
construction cost part of it.
Okay. Well, I was expecting it in the alternate list because I didn't see it in the other project, so that's what I was concerned about.
Architects really struggle when they get into this scenario where they think construction costs are higher than what your project can afford. And deciding what to move out, put in that alternate list is tough for them. one of their main criteria for moving something out is the ease of which it can be done at a different time without influencing the rest of the project. So for example, you didn't see in the alternates cutting out 1/4 of the air conditioning because that's not a practical alternative. But on the other hand, renovating the Spartan Bowl is something that could very easily be done as a separate project, say in the 2004-2005 capital project.
I just want to agree with Carl on the windows. I think in our original, at least my understanding, the windows originally were an alternate. We were only going to be replacing the windows with the new construction and the ones that had to be replaced. And in the original design that Patrick gave us, the windows were an alternate and the auditorium was an alternate. But the roof, was it not always part of the original bid, the re-roofing, the 1950s edition?
Everything that you said is true at some point in history, but there was actually a history before that where all of these things were a part of the base bid except for the Spartan Bowl. That was the only thing that was left out. The first thing that was moved out of the project was the windows.
Okay.
And then the auditorium and so forth. The re-roof was one of the later ones that was moved out. And all that they had determined there was that there was a section over the 1950s wing that was in still fairly good shape, that could wait a number of years before we would have to deal with that.
And also, the capital projects fund, future allocation amount that we're saving forward, does that part of the financing remain the same? We've intended to save $4 million in that fund. And will that $4 million, as it becomes available, be spent specifically for the middle school in terms of the way the financing's planned right now?
We currently have $2.6 million saved, and the budget that you will be given next month will have another $1.4 million allocated for that. So by the end of next year, we will have all $4 million.
All the savings account will be for
It is, and it is a rainy day fund that can only be used for this.
We earmark it. Yeah, right.
Will there be any more of a breakdown of information on the alternates or the sheet that we have? I mean, is this the detail that we're supposed to look at? Or is there anything else that we need to?
When we had a sheet at the design development phase that had a breakdown of the alternates, what the cost was for the electrical, for example, what the cost for the seating was in the Spartan Bowl and the seating in the auditorium. So those general categories were broken out for us. I think they were getting a little pinched for time here toward the end, and so we didn't get that detail. All they gave us was totals, because they had to quickly get those totals from Berkler over to Umball so that they could recalculate what's the impact on everything else.
Okay.
And so we actually had architect, construction manager, and financial advisor all working together to pull that information. In addition to that, we had both the architect and construction manager then working on specifications and deciding on what the bid packets were going to be. And we ended up with 30 bid packages that it's going to be bid on. So I think that's what we ran into. So my understanding is that when we are presented with the bids on July 23rd, we will have a breakdown, which you will get ahead of time.
Okay.
And do we have a process by which we look at different alternates, and is that a board meeting or?
We have a very short timeline between receiving the bids and the STAR committee. We'll have an opportunity to conclude some of the preparatory work of looking at the alternates. So that the members on the STAR committee, it's very important that they try to attend the review of the bids. But then this board will decide the alternates at the 23rd meeting. Correct?
That's a different meeting.
I would assume out of that meeting would come some recommendations, and then the whole board would have to agree or disagree or move them around.
So we will fax you the information as soon as we have it, the full board.
Would it be instructive or helpful to think about prioritizing the list?
Yes, that's what we'd like for you to do from this point forward. I can pass around the if you do not have the amounts for each alternate here.
It was on that one slide, but it wasn't on this slide.
Is each alternate by category? They can't break the alternates apart, can they? I mean, let the roofing come together at $295, just all together,
No, they're not all.
so they can take.
Each number that you see out the side, each whole number in one. So when you get, even under 6, for example, you can break out parts of that.
Parts of that, so we can,
For example, in the Spartan Bowl, you could do acoustical and not do the seats.
yeah, we'll send you a copy of the price list.
Dr. Clay's running that off right now.
issue.
Thank you.
Some discussions prior to that meeting would be helpful between individual board members and all. That would be helpful.
I think just in talking to some in the community, and this just for the other board members and for the community members that are here tonight, first assurances they wanted to hear from me was, we're not going to raise taxes beyond what we already said. And I think that, obviously we can't go past what the 1028 was anyway, but Vaughn, in the meeting that we'd had with you and the STAR committee when we met, the annual payment remains the same. I think, that ought to be clear for our community. The total project cost remains the same if we should choose to spend that interest savings and add to the total project. The taxpayer's liability that we all went through, and this was in February, doesn't change from what we said. And even though we can do more because of that interest savings, it would appear so at this point anyway, that what the community's liability is going forward is no more than where we were in February. And in some of these aspects of the alternates, just for the other board members, I kind of agree with Carl. The auditorium and the windows, obviously the roof, those kinds of things to me are very important to fix and fix now. So we can move forward with that building for 20 or 25 years without any big ticket items that we've got to go back to the taxpayer, or we've got to not be able to go back down on that capital funds rate. We went from 92 cents to the limit that the state gives us, which is I think $1.30 in that range. And what we've told our taxpayers is that capital funds future allocation pot that we're saving forward, we're going to take that back down to where we were a couple years ago. That's a promise that this board had made, and it will enable us to do that if we're able to go ahead and capture this interest savings now. We won't be tapping that capital funds project to fix things in the middle school in the next years ahead. And just for the board members, I would support looking at that interest savings and spending it wisely, maybe not on all the items, but on some of the items.
And as I share with the key communicators in the cover letter, the debt service fund is audited every year by the state to guarantee taxpayers of our commitment to not exceed the annual lease payments on this project.
Well, I guess I would only add the other side of that coin, even with alternates, if we were to get so fortunate as to come in under what we advertise, and obviously that's going to be a decrease for taxpayers if that would happen. We're not going to try to sit here and think of thrills to be certain we use all that. In fact, you see in front of you, these board members, the things that would be considered. And contingency, of course, of those change orders. I'm certain we might have one during the process of the renovation.
One or two.
Yeah, right.
Well, as I look at this, comparing the list that was just given to me compared to your construction costs, which one of those is more reliable in terms of the actual costs that we're going to be
The
incurring?
list that you got is a list that came
This
out
is the one.
probably 3 weeks prior to what I published for.
And this one on this sheet is
the
more
latest.
accurate. Okay.
Part of the reason for that was just some things that when they asked us exactly what do you want here, what do you want there, we fine-tuned exactly what we were wanting to do and not do. For example, we went into the Spartan Bowl and looked at exactly, precisely what they had figured in versus what we thought we needed. So there was some tweaking. In fact, the cost of renovating the Spartan Bowl went down considerably as a result of that. But that Spartan Bowl estimate's been anywhere from $450,000 up to $900,000 over the course of the last 6 months or so, depending upon what was included and not included.
Any other board members or anyone? I want to got a few minutes here, and I want to break around 6:15 or so for the board meeting. So, is anyone, patrons, that anyone that might want to speak to this? You've got a few minutes. And I guess we'd have a motion to adjourn.
I move to adjourn.
Is there a second to that?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?